to Mike Malott, a former RTE current affairs reporter and also the author of Banished Babies. It's a story of a baby traffic organized by nuns, sanctioned by an archbishop, administered by civil servants, and approved by politicians whose main concern was secrecy. Mike, thank you for joining us tonight and answering our questions. We definitely have a lot of inquiries as a result of coming across your book, Banished Babies. Can you tell us a little bit of the history of the Ireland's baby export business?
Well, this story began to emerge in the late 1990s, around the same time as a lot of other stories began to emerge about the care of children, or the lack of care of children, by the state and by institutions run by the Catholic Church. Stories began to come out about children being sent to America for adoption, which was something that nobody seemed to have heard about before. So the stories were very scant and few and far between at the beginning. And one of the things I remember clearly, one of the first stories I heard was a woman who had worked for Aer Lingus, which is the Irish national airline, telling a story about escorting children to America on Aer Lingus planes. They were the stewardesses working on the plane, and part of their job, it seems, was to deliver children to America. And she often wondered what this was all about, because it happened regularly, but she never really found out. And I talked to this woman, and she told me a story where she said she was in the Aer Lingus office in the centre of Dublin one day when an American couple came in and very loudly said, "Hi, we're from America. We'd like to thank you for the babies that we bought, and we're here to buy another one." And she was absolutely astonished by this, because they came from nowhere. They just come in and thanked the staff and thanked Ireland for letting them buy babies. So that's when I got interested in the story. I suppose as a current affairs journalist, I was always interested in something a bit more than adoption, which if there was a financial edge to it, if there was some sort of unknown scandal, then that sort of whetted my appetite, and so I began to look into it at that point. And the first thing that really happened, I did a program for RTE about it, where we went to America and we found a lot of these children who'd been sent to America and talked to them. It was very personal stories. And then it appeared that there had been several thousand files in the Department of Foreign Affairs in Ireland which had never been released. And initially there was a denial on the part of one of the government ministers that there were any files. The very following day, the Minister for Foreign Affairs put his hands up and said, "Actually, there are files in my department, thousands of them, and I'm going to release them." And those files were put into the public archive, the National Archive, and I got hold of them immediately. The very next day, I got them, and the book was based on that. And basically what they are, these are the policy files. So they're the state's own files that came out of the Department of Foreign Affairs, relating to the entire period when children were sent to America for adoption. And I think they really reveal a very disturbing story that had never really been told before, and has never really been appreciated even now, even though I wrote this book. I suppose it came at a time when the focus was on other and more obvious stories of child abuse. And this isn't really a story explicitly about child abuse, although I think there is a lot of abuse involved. So it never really achieved the attention, I think, that it probably deserved. And it's a story that has still never been fully told in this country.
What sorts of stories did you come across that were quite shocking?
Well, I think I think the whole thing actually turned out to be very shocking, because it was highly organised by the Catholic Church. And basically what you're talking about is thousands upon thousands of young women, unmarried women, who had children, and the Church did not want to admit that this phenomenon existed, that there was any such thing as children born out of wedlock in Ireland. I mean, first of all, you can see that in that the homes that they were born in were called orphanages. Well, an orphan is someone whose parents are both dead, mother and father are dead. In this instance, of course, the parents neither was dead, neither the father nor the mother was dead. They just weren't married. But they called them orphanages, so it appeared to anyone looking at them that all these children in there were children whose parents had died. But I mean, if you did the sums, that was patently ridiculous, that so many parents, you would have had mass deaths of young people if it were the case that their parents had died. So quite clearly they were not orphans at all. They were the children of unmarried mothers. And the church was always keen to keep the lid on this. It's a subject that was never talked about. If a family had a daughter who got pregnant, very often she would be put out of the family home. She would have to go and find her own way. And in some ways, yes, the nuns were the ones who gave them somewhere to go. But of course, the Catholic Church had created the hostility to them in the first place. So it wasn't as if they were doing them a favour. They'd created the problem, and then they were left picking up some of the pieces. But in fact, I think what's most scandalous here is that they turned it to a business. That at the time when this began to really develop, it was immediately after the Second World War. And a lot of American soldiers were based in Europe at the time, and they had been taking children from Europe in large numbers. There were shiploads of children taken to America for adoption. And a lot of European countries then began, I think, to realise that they were losing a whole generation, the next generation, to replace the people who had died in the war. So the export of children from all of Europe was stopped, except Ireland. So a lot of American soldiers turned to Ireland to get children. And I think that's really how it began. And when they started coming, there were no rules, no regulation, there was no adoption legislation. And it seems that they could come here and take these children of unmarried mothers, back to America at will. And in fact, the book starts with the story of one guy who came, and he was interviewed on his way back to America, and he had 2 children. And he said that they were a surprise for his wife, and that he had picked them up in an Irish orphanage. Now, that to me is utterly scandalous. The Catholic Church, I think, then realised that something was going on here. And they didn't like it because they would have assumed, and probably rightly so, that most of the mothers of these children were Catholics, because Ireland, of course, was 99% Catholic country. But they had no way of knowing what religion the people who were taking them to America were. And the Catholic Church wanted to ensure that the children of Catholic Irish mothers went to American Catholics. So at that point, the Catholic Church stepped in to try and put some sort of organisation on this. And they drew up rules and regulations, which the state agreed to. And the state seemed to be quite happy to leave the Catholic Church to organise this. And initially, the Archbishop, the senior Catholic cleric in Ireland, John Charles McQuaid, was personally involved in this, in drawing up the rules and regulations. And they turned to an American Catholic organisation called Catholic Charities, who were given the job of vetting the children in America. The Catholic Charities was given the job of vetting the would-be adoptive parents in America. And their primary concern was to ensure that they were Catholics, first and foremost. And secondly, it seems that they wanted to ensure that they had some means of support, that they had money. But the fact that they were practicing Catholics seems to have been the primary concern, rather than any concern with their ability to actually be parents of children. And I think what emerged subsequently in a lot of these cases was that some of the American adopters had been rejected by the American adoption system as being unsuitable for one reason or another as adoptive parents, but yet they'd been able to turn to Ireland, and simply because they were practicing Catholics, they were able to get children from here. So the way it was organised, the children were born in Catholic-run, as I say, orphanages, which were actually mother and child homes, run by nuns. The state had to get involved because the children needed passports to leave the country. But the state seemed to be happy enough to go on the verifications and documentation provided by the nuns. The state didn't appear to have an independent policy of its own, and at that time in Ireland, the state did not want to do anything to upset the church, and particularly John Charles McQuaid, who was a very dominant personality. And from looking at state records at the time, you can see that the state was quite happy to let the church make all the running in the adoption process.
So they did nothing about it? Nothing to stop it?
No, not only did they do nothing to stop it, they facilitated it at every turn. The state issued passports to children, and the state required mothers to sign. A mother had to sign 2 documents which came into the state's possession. The first was an application for a passport for their child, and the second was agreement to the adoption by the child in America. Now, I've looked at a lot of those documents because they remain in state files, and the signatures are different. So that the signatures were actually forged. I can say that now quite authoritatively. The signatures were forged by nuns. And they were so disregarding of the state authorities or of anyone questioning this that they didn't care that they had put a different signature on each of these two critical legal documents. So you can see a signature of a mother applying for a passport for a child is completely different from the signature of the same mother agreeing to the adoption of that child. And I've seen a number of documents like that.
Could you explain to us what sorts of documents did you find? I mean, were they cooperative in providing these to you?
Well, once the archive came into the public domain, I mean, it's policy here that state archives come into the public domain after 30 years. This was more like 40 years, 50 years in some cases, before these documents were released. But they decided to release the whole lot together, so some of them even predated. You know, they hadn't quite gone the 30 years when I got my hands on them. So yes, once the Department of Foreign Affairs decided to release these documents, they released them very, very fully indeed. But what they did do was they took names out, so none of the documents identified individuals. These were documents about state policy and about the concerns that the state might have had at various times, about their dealings with the Catholic Church, about their dealings with American diplomats and so on. And they're mostly documents that were generated around the process of issuing passports, because that was the main involvement of the state, was the issuing of passports.
Do we know which Catholic-run orphanages were taking place in Ireland?
Well, most of them were. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to name them to you, but they're all named in the book with the numbers. I mean, do you want me to do that? Do you want me to look at the book and sort of say?
Yeah, that would be great.
I might have to put my glasses on.
One of the things I'm saying is a lot of people don't believe that people that are supposed to represent God can possibly do something like this. So
yeah. I'm going to have to put glasses on, sorry about that. change of shot.
Do you actually know which Catholic-run orphanages?
Yes, we do. Yeah, I've detailed them all in the book, and I can tell you some of them. The biggest was St Patrick's Guild, which was in Dublin. Records show that they sent 515 children to America. The next was Sean Ross Abbey, which sent 438. And then the Mother and Child Home in Castle Pollard sent 278. St Patrick's Home, again in Dublin, sent 254. St Clare's in Stamullen, which is just outside Dublin, sent 130. The Sacred Heart Convent in Cork sent 98. And the Catholic Women's Aid Adoption Society in Cork sent 37. St Joseph's Convent in Croom sent 29. And then there was a Protestant one, the Protestant Adoption Society, well, all of them combined sent 24. So you can see it's predominantly a Catholic operation. St Bridget's Orphanage sent 14, and then miscellaneous, because there were a lot of small homes, children's homes operating here as well. They sent 101. So this is the total number of passports that we know to have been issued, and that comes to 1,918. But there were a lot of children, particularly in the early years, who went without passports. And there's no number on that. And there was also a very prominent scam involved, where American women would come to Ireland and would go into a nursing home, a maternity home where children were born, and they would pretend when they went in that they were pregnant, and they would come out with a baby. But the baby obviously had been born by an Irish woman. And they would go to the American embassy and have that child put onto their own passport. So we don't know how many children fall into that category, but I believe that was quite a widespread practice. So again, the total number of children that were sent to America in this period is unknown, which I think is one of the scandals.
We're speaking to a lot of people that perhaps may not believe that representatives of God could possibly do something like this. What sorts of documents did you come across? Registries? You said over 1,918 passports were actually issued. How did you even come across the archives? When did you decide to stop? I mean, it seems like you opened up a can of worms. At what time did you feel you had enough information in order to produce the book?
Well, I mean, what I had was the documentation was very, very thorough. You know, these were state documents. I did also get access to Archbishop McQuaid's own papers in relation to adoptions, which was the first time his papers had been open to anyone. Now, they didn't reveal an awful lot, because I suppose he was an intelligent enough man not to commit most of his thoughts to paper on this subject. But the state documents were very thorough, and they involved communication, because the children were coming from Catholic nursing homes. They were run by nuns, so an awful lot of the communication, even around passports, was between the state and the orphanages, between the state and the nuns. So there's there are a lot of letters from the Mothers Superior who were running these homes to civil servants, talking about their requirements and their needs and their plans and prospects and so on. So I mean, it is a very well documented operation, and the involvement of the church in it is not in dispute. This isn't something that the church has ever tried to deny. The church will say that they were doing good for these children, because at the time, from the Second World War, this went on right up to the early 1970s, Ireland was a very underdeveloped country, quite a poor country, and America was seen as somewhere where the streets were lined with gold. And if you could get a career, if you could have a life in America with an American family, the feeling was it could only be to the good. Now, there might be an element of truth in that somewhere, although I must say I find it reduces happiness to wealth. And wealth was a very relative thing anyway, because I think Irish nuns looking at American families who had maybe a little bit of money, they would view them as wealthy, whereas in fact in American terms they weren't. So an awful lot of these kids were going to very, very ordinary, run-of-the-mill American families, where their prospects in life would be, very mundane. They weren't going to Beverly Hills or whatever. And part of the problem I think that emerged subsequently was that as I said, some of the people who had tried to adopt children in America and had been refused then came to Ireland and adopted in Ireland. And I know from talking to a number of these now adults, but the children who had gone there as adoptees, that they were adopted by people who were sick. And they had very, very hard lives. And they came to believe that the only reason they had been adopted was in order to work from childhood, looking after a sick adoptive parent. So that was a reality for a lot of these children. I also spoke to one woman at length who all she knew about her life was that she was sexually abused from infancy right up to the age of 18. When she was 18, she discovered that she had actually been adopted from Ireland. She didn't know that previously. She found that she'd been adopted. She was then able to access certain records of her own. And she found that while this organisation, Catholic Charities, had been sent out to review her adoptive parents and recommend them as suitable or otherwise, and had recommended them, that Catholic Charities had never actually interviewed or met or seen the father, the man who abused her, and that Catholic Charities had been satisfied with a letter from the priest to say that this man was a regular churchgoer. And that was the only criterion that they applied, and on that basis this girl was sent to America to face a life of abuse.
Overall, how would you rate the assessment of these adoptions by the Catholic Charities according to what you discovered?
Well, I think Catholic Charities is a very, very large organisation in America, and it's the biggest Catholic charity in the country. But they admitted themselves at one point to Irish civil servants that they did not have the manpower to operate the system of adoptions on behalf of the Irish Church. They just did not have experienced people who could go out, social workers. I mean, this, if you're placing a child for adoption, it requires a very skilled social worker to go in and assess the would-be adoptive parents to make sure that they are suitable in all respects as adoptive parents. Catholic Charities admitted, I think it was in 1956, one of the head men from Catholic Charities came to Ireland, and he was interviewed at length by senior civil servants in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and he admitted to them that there were huge problems in the way Catholic Charities administered this scheme. They didn't have the people to properly assess adoptive parents. They had discovered that even within their own ranks, there was at least one man operating a racket, a baby business, that he was somehow or other getting children from Ireland in the name of adoptive parents who either didn't exist or were somehow or other sidestepped. He was accumulating these children for himself and then selling them. And this is on the record. This is on the records of the Department of Foreign Affairs in Ireland, that this racket was being run in America through Catholic Charities to sell children to God knows who in America. Now, that in itself is absolutely and utterly scandalous. But much more scandalous to my mind is the fact that the Department of Foreign Affairs here did absolutely nothing about it. They didn't try to investigate it. They didn't go any further. Their main concern, like the Catholic Church, was to avoid scandal. And this whole episode was brushed under the carpet. So even though the Department of Affairs knew that there were major problems with the welfare of children being sent to America, they ignored that problem.
Is there documents that somewhere track the kind of money involved?
Well, what I came across mainly was letters from these mother and child homes, from nuns to Americans who had adopted children. That, as far as I can see, there wasn't a price attached to a child. You didn't pay to adopt a child. And in fact, from 1952 onwards, when an adoption law was passed in Ireland, it made it a criminal offence to charge someone for an adoption. So it would have been a criminal offence to explicitly charge for a child in adoption. But what the nuns did was they wrote very subtly to adoptive parents, pointing out that they were still looking after children, that they had very scarce resources, that they didn't have the means to purchase toys or proper clothing or food or whatever. But of course, I mean, that's highly unlikely given the Catholic Church is actually quite a wealthy organisation. But that was the sort of story. I've seen letters to this effect from nuns to people who have adopted children in America, and the people who adopted the children just felt an obligation then to write a cheque, send a cheque, and I think for some people that became habitual, so that year after year they would send a cheque every year to the nuns.
Is there documents that show how these children actually ended up in these orphanages?
Well, the way the orphanages worked, the children were born in these homes. So they were mother and baby homes. So the mother would go into the home when she was pregnant, and they had to work. They had to work for their keep. So they cleaned. A lot of the homes had land attached, and they kept cattle. They grew vegetables, and the girls would work in the fields, and they would clean the floors and scrub and all of that. And they had to stay well beyond the period when the child was born. So the mothers would stay with their babies for up to 2 years after they were born in these homes. So there's obviously been a lot, very, very tight bonding between the mother and baby. And a lot of stories have been told of when an American adoptive parent has been found, the nuns come in and simply take the baby, and it's done without notice, without warning. Or the mother could be told with an hour's notice to have her child ready, that the adoptive parents have arrived to come and take the child. But the mothers, that's obviously very, very traumatic for these women. A lot of women were deeply scarred, that I spoke to, were deeply scarred by that experience of having their child virtually snatched from their hands after being with that child. The child would be 2 years old when it was taken. And that obviously was very damaging to those women.
It was taken away without their consent?
Well, very often without their consent. They were made to feel that they had... there is such a thing as informed consent. If you're going to consent to something, you have to know exactly what it is you're consenting to. And that is common law. And it was in those days as it is now. I would imagine And from talking to those women, they were put under such pressure that even if they were giving
If you've been a victim of clergy abuse, don't stay quiet. Speak out. Write to us at contact@vaticancrimes.us.